Let me tell you a little secret. If you hadn't necessarily realized, there have been throughout the past couple of days at DTM a secret session happening. DTM, Lakestar, McKinsey & Company, and NATO Innovation Fund have held some invite-only sessions covering the 50 senior armed forces leaders alongside Europe's primes and neo-primes to discuss next-generation defense capabilities for NATO front lines. This session aims to lift the hood on what actually happened during those discussions, from the defense procurement to space-enabled situation awareness, to aerial defense, to cost-effective precision strikes. Our next speakers will be able to tell you a lot more about what actually happened during signals from the front lines. I would love to welcome to the stage Admiral Christian Bock, Head of Innovation Center Bundeswehr. Round of applause, please. I will welcome Lieutenant General Tom Coppinga-Symes, Commander of Cyber and Specialist Operations Commandant at the UK Ministry of Defence. Round of applause for him, please, as well. And last but not least, I would love to welcome Rafael Osejo Arias, partner at McKinsey & Company. Huge round of applause as well, please, for Rafael. All right.
Sorry about that.
There's one guy missing, General Cavioli.
I wasn't aware.
Ah.
Could you inform me again? We also, I hear, need General Cavioli on stage. Please, huge round of applause for him as well. All right, I will leave you to it and go.
Thanks very much. And yes, that was General Chris Cavioli, former Supreme Allied Commander Europe until this time last year, based in Mons, just outside Brussels. Good afternoon, everybody. Great to be here at DTM, and I hope you've all had a good couple of days. So the aim of our roundtables was to identify the demand signal to industry for deep tech in defense. And as you've heard, that was split into 3 separate roundtables, one focusing on drone and aerial defense, all of these encapsulating lessons from Ukraine, so a very strong focus on drone and aerial defense, on cost-effective deep precision strike, which General Cavioli will speak on space-enabled situational awareness, which I'll talk on, and then on innovation-ready defense tech procurement, which Rafa will speak about. Before we move into the individual roundtables, there were some common themes throughout, shown on the next slide. And these are the sort of common to all things that we in Europe and NATO more broadly need to do to face into the level of threat we have in front of us. The first thing is deregulation. All of our nations tend to be very safe, but we are not yet secure. And years of peace have meant that our training regimes, our procurement regimes are very strong on safety, but we are not delivering the security of the nation we need. So deregulation is critical and a big political challenge. And of course, I'm very aware that as AI proliferates and gets closer to the nuclear firing chain, we need to be very careful that we maintain regulation in some areas, but take risk elsewhere. The second thing is reindustrialization. One of the big lessons of Ukraine is this onshoring and friendshoring to ensure that our supply chain are closer to our front lines when we need them. The third thing is resilience. Wars are very rarely short, they tend to be long. And nowadays, when you're not in old-fashioned war, you're in a persistent state of hybrid conflict where we, citizens, our factories, our families, are also targets on the battlefield. So resilience, all important. And fourthly, another big lesson from Ukraine, we need to reconnect our suppliers with our warfighters. We need to reconnect our engineers to their customers in the front line. So those are the 4 overall themes that we identify. But to delve now, I'm going to ask Christian Bock to talk about what they learned in their roundtable on drone and aerial defense.
Okay, thanks a lot, Tom. So drone and aerial defense coming with a view on Ukraine gives us an example how technological developments in a wartime scenario gives us impressions how we have to transform our own system and to review our own system to cope with coming threats we are expecting. So always having this example in front of our television and getting the experiences from our Ukrainian partners who have been at the table are giving us the viewpoints how to change our system. And there are several steps to do which have a direct impact in technological development and changing our regulatories and our society as well, because we discussed in this environment that we have to have this all over and whole of society approach to fight against future threats. So I'll give you some examples because problems are laying on the table, which is that we have a compliance and security problem because we always have this peacetime regulatory burdens that gives us a problem testing and exploring new technologies in our own environment. We have a mismatch of innovation and procurement cycles because we have certification issues, we have developing and contract issues. The Ukraine side doesn't care about these topics in war times. We have the uneconomical costs of interception of man-made or handmade materials who the Ukrainians have to fight against. And we have these supply chain dependencies which are directly connected on our economic systems. And we have, of course, the current existing vulnerability of defense assets that we are currently have in our system. And we're always discussing the question about how deep have a human be in the loop or on the loop, fighting against the current threats. So what are the top accelerators and solutions that have direct impact on this event? Because we are looking for new technologies, new ideas, new passes against the situation. This is the continuous innovation through software-defined defense and layered stockpiling, because you cannot have a complete system always in the current technological development mood, but you have to separate and differentiate your system. So you have to build up continuous simulation and training environments together with the troops to experiment all technologies on a continuous basis, and including the technological developments from Ukraine. And we have, especially in Germany, to regulate our system as we would like to fight. And this is an artificial way to approach a warfighting scenario, but we have to think about this direction. And of course, and this is exactly the reason why you're sitting here, we have to foster the close military startup collaboration on scene and here, and especially looking at dual-use capacities. And of course, we have to decide that we have to have the man on the loop, but not in the loop, because we cannot cope with current threats. So these are exactly the main topics out of my roundtable.
Thanks, Christian. And please, there'll be an opportunity for questions when we finish speaking. So please think how you'd like to test Christian on any of that. General Chris, affordable, deep precision strike.
Yeah. So our roundtable was blessed, Tom. We had 2 former 4-star commanders who commanded deep strike during their periods. We had 3 retired 3-stars. We had the director of the Bundeswehr's innovation unit. We had 3 investors. We had a founder. We had a variety of people, but most important, we had members of the Ukrainian Armed Forces Unmanned Systems Force, which is the pioneering force that the Ukrainian Armed Forces built in order to handle en masse large-scale employment of unmanned systems. So we benefited greatly from everybody, but especially from our Ukrainian colleagues' recent experience. It's specific to their fight, but it's nevertheless very educational. So the first thing we did in our group was to define deep fires, because it's not simply a matter of distance. It is in fact measurable. You can define deep fires by the range of the weapon system, but you can also define it by how far into the enemy's distribution do you go. And then you can also define it by the target type, the value or the sensitivity of the target. All of these things elevate you to strategic levels. And someplace in there is where deep fires is. That matters because it affects how you organize to deliver deep fires. Typically, which echelon of command should have which systems available to it, which should have the command and control and the engagement authority for those systems and those targets. This is very important because those are the proper interlocutors for founders and innovators to deal with, to discover what are the precise requirements. And we discovered that those precise requirements drivers are at different levels depending on how you define deep fires. This is especially complicated in Europe because some of those fires will be nationally controlled and some will be controlled by the Supreme Allied Commander for Europe. These will operate on different time horizons. Before Article 5, we can expect nations to deliver deep fires. After Article 5 and after the granting of specific authorities, SACEUR will do it. So it's not only the echelon at which an entrepreneur has to engage, it's also which system, which organizational system, national or collective, should he or she engage. But that doesn't help us with the practical questions folks in this room have. The practical questions folks in this room have can be answered just a little bit more simply after our discussion. First of all, there is the question, how valuable are deep fire effectors without the rest of the targeting system and the intelligence collection system? And the answer is not very. You have to have an entire targeting system in place with the ability to collect and process and disseminate intelligence of a targeting quality in real time in order to make this useful. But that's a difficult thing to develop, and it doesn't help us very much in the short term. So we determined that in the short term, the best thing to do is just to start to build the effectors. If we just start to build the munitions, that will force into existence the other parts of a full-scale deep fires system. And what should we build? What should we build? Systems that deliver across ranges of 500 kilometers or more. Number one, ranges of 500 kilometers or more. Second, systems that are survivable, that will get to the target. And there are three real ways to be survivable to the target. The first is by mission planning, supporting fires to clear corridors through the electromagnetic interference and through the physical interception devices the adversary might have arrayed. So mission planning. The second is intrinsic to the vehicle itself, stealth. And the third is speed and trajectory. So the advantage of a ballistic missile, for example, or a hypersonic over a long-range drone. First, long range, 500 kilometers plus. Second, survivable. Third, precise. How precise? Precise enough for the weapon to have the effect that it needs to have on the given target. Those targets can either be stationary or moving. So there are two different types of precision required there. And then finally, and we see this in Iran, we see this in Ukraine, lots of them. Don't build a few, build a lot. So the price point per munition has to be low enough for national governments to be able to buy lots of them, not few of them. Some of these characteristics come into competition with each other, but the balance is going to be the important thing, and that will depend exactly on the organization that will be employing them. So it was a very productive roundtable, and I was lucky to be part of it. Thanks, Tom.
Thanks, General. So some themes emerging here. I mean, firstly, the defensive aspect Christian spoke about, which occupies everybody's minds as we watch the horror in Ukraine. But sometimes, of course, your best form of defense is offense, and not only to sort of block the arrow to kill the archer, but also to get into the supply chain and burn down the factories that are creating the arrows, if you follow that metaphor. But of course, what knits them together, both defensively and offensively, is an intelligence and targeting system. And in the 21st century, a vast amount of that data is gathered now from above us in space. So our third roundtable was asked to look at space-based intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. And of course, the space cognoscenti amongst you will know it's not just data we collect from space, but we also get precision navigation given to us from space, and we also get timing given to us from space. And you're probably all aware, none of us could live our lives, none of us could benefit from algorithmic training in the stock markets, none of us could navigate with GMAPs without those constellations above us in the sky. So we were asked to look at the problems and the opportunities we've got in the space segment for defense. So the problems, the blockers we identified initially are fairly simple. Unsurprisingly, for NATO nations, there is a huge dependence, a reliance, but a dependence on US systems. Because for years, space was a geostationary orbit play, and those satellites cost an awful lot of money to build, they take an awful lot of money to get up there, and they take an awful lot of money to sustain and to protect up in the geo belt. So there's a big dependence on the USA, and as you come down from the geo belt into LEO, into low Earth orbit, we all know about Starlink. We've all seen the dependence on Starlink in Ukraine, and again, we need to be thinking about diversifying from that dependence. The second problem we identified was there's a lot of collection. We tend in the military to love our sensors, the things that collect data, but we tend not to think about how we process, exploit, and then disseminate that data. So there's an imbalance between our ability to collect data and our ability to do something with it and give information to the right levels, whether it's to protect our people or indeed to take the fight to the enemy. The third thing, and this was brought out brilliantly by a Ukrainian soldier on our panel who leads one of their unmanned systems brigades. What we now need is very low latency signals from space to be able to guide uncrewed systems in the battle space. We also had a former Secretary of State on the panel who clearly was looking at a 24-hour system of a very high precision, a very politically difficult strike. He needed to be able to say what he needed to know and get the answer back within 24 hours to satisfy political decision-making. That is a high burden. But when you're trying to navigate uncrewed systems on the battlefield, you're down to much lower latency, and you need data from space in a matter of minutes, and in some cases, seconds, and that's a very high burden. So latency for robotic autonomy was the third issue we identified. And then fourthly, the fourth big issue is we still have a procurement system in space that is optimized for those big geo satellites, not for low Earth orbit constellations like we're seeing spring up and which any of the space companies in the audience will be concerned with. So that was the fourth area, procurement system that was set up for long play, decades-long procurements for very exquisite systems, not for more easily available and attritable systems. And the sort of answers we came up with in broad terms, informed by an amazing mix of mainly SMEs, but we had some primes on the round table too, were this. Clearly, we need to diversify the amount of satellites we're putting up there and get away from a sole dependence on the US. And of course, the US is pushing us very hard to do that too. And I hasten to add that across the 32 nations of NATO, that doesn't mean that every nation needs to be putting up their own satellites. Some of the smaller nations will have a good launch site to bring to the game. Some of them will have a good terrestrial sensor network that they can bring to the overall space fight. We don't need everybody launching their own satellites. And it's almost certain that we'll see mini-lateral groupings within NATO collaborating to ensure that we get the right constellations up there. The second thing attending to the processing and exploitation is to take on commercial and industrial best practice of handling big data loads and exploiting and disseminating those big data loads. One of the things in the military is we don't generally deal with very big data, not when we compare it with Facebook or with financial markets. And therefore, there's plenty of capacity in the system. There's very little technology we need to invent to handle data loads in defense. We need to overcome our own process problems, not to invent very much. So taking commercial data analytics approaches was the second thing we identified. Thirdly, this is now a domain we fight in. So our threat adversaries are now secretly and actually quite overtly offering us threats in the space domain, not just down on Earth. So the third thing we all focused on was space domain awareness. That is us being able to look up, both from the Earth but also on orbit, to understand the threats and either be able to maneuver out of the way of those threats or to counter those threats, either on orbit or from Earth. And I would just observe there wasn't quite as much focus on that from the round table or the companies I've met this time round, that issue of space domain awareness, the ability to look up and understand it as a warfighting domain. And then the last issue, unsurprisingly, when it came to the procurement theme, was this issue of public-private collaboration. And as you've both heard from Christian and General Chris, the need to get suppliers, to get engineers in close contact with warfighters, with a few less business development people in the way, forgive me for the business development people in the room, and get right down low to the warfighter, and so that we have a constant feedback of data from the front line to the engineer and from the engineer forward. And I think at the moment we're far too stratified. We're trying to conduct that relationship at far too high a level, and we need to force it down. Again, we had some amazing testimony from our Ukrainian friends, and both at the core level, as they shift to a core structure, but also right down to brigade level and unit level, they have engineers forward and have a constant pipeline of data showing them what kit works, what doesn't work, and how to spiral that kit and develop it. And that's whether it's space or uncrewed systems or those deep strike platforms we've spoken about. So those were the judgments of the space-based ISR. You'll have been identifying throughout those sort of common themes about procurement. But Rafa, what did your roundtable look at in terms of those themes for innovation-ready defense tech procurement?
Thank you, Tom. So on the defense tech procurement roundtable, what we discussed is mainly around three things. First, what is the challenge that we are really trying to address? Second, what are the lessons learned that we can take out from Ukraine or any other conflict that we are seeing around the world at the time? And finally, what are the practical solutions that we can implement? If we think about what is the challenge, the main challenge is procurement, especially in European countries, but almost in every nation in the world, is too slow. The underlying reason is we have a procurement bureaucracy that was mainly designed after the financial crisis in 2008, whose aim was to control and contain public spending. But that doesn't fit with the needs of a wartime or when you are preparing for a potential crisis. So we need to first think about if our highly centralized, highly bureaucratic procurement processes are fit for purpose. The second challenge is innovation at the moment is too far away from the battlefield. And part of it is because the funds are not coming from the needs of the battlefield. They are coming from R&D organizations in the different MODs or in other public administrations. And finally, the third challenge here is the industrial capacity and capabilities are not prepared to address the challenges in the battlefield. As you said, Tom, they are too far away. They are not in the mood of understanding the problem of the soldier in the front line. But what are the lessons learned that we can get from the conflicts that we are seeing now? And the first one is, yes, there's a lot of innovation. There's a lot that we are listening to. We hear a lot about drones. But first of all, it's not everything about drones. Drones are an important part of today's conflict, but traditional warfare systems are still being used. Artillery is very important. Infantry is very important. Naval warfighters, aircrafts, everything is still there. It's not only drones. The second lesson is mass and quantity still matters. Wars are not won by having one great missile. You need to have good enough, and as you said, General, good enough in a very large quantities, because you're going to use a lot. The third lesson is procurement needs to go down to the fighter unit. It cannot pass through a process that takes 6 weeks to get the request to a central agency, and then 3 months to publish the RFP, and then 1 month to reply, blah, 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 because by the time the soldier gets the material is absolutely obsolete. Third, regarding innovation, highly technological advanced visions tend to take a lot of time. And being too pragmatic probably is not enough to tackle the level of innovation that is happening in the battlefield. So there's a middle point that needs to be achieved. And getting those engineers closer to the front line, understanding what are the problems to tackle, and attacking them in incremental steps is much better than trying to go through a long multi-year process of innovation. And finally, another lesson learned is war is not only happening in the front line. What is happening way beyond the front line? What is happening in the factories? What is happening in the logistic hubs? What is happening at the homes? So everything needs to be protected in its own way. What were the solutions that were discussed in the roundtable? First of all, we need to provide procurement flexibility. Of course, not everything needs to be procured the same way. Not everything needs to be procured with an app, as if you were buying from Amazon, which, by the way, that is one solution. But combined with that, you also need to still procure the complex systems. But you need to allow the soldier to ask for their ammunition, their drones, their small pieces of material in a very fast way. And the second solution is the logistics need to be there in place to make those materials available to the warfighter in just a matter of hours or a few days. We need to support innovation. And supporting innovation comes from providing funding and lines of innovation, lines of R&D to startups. It comes with, as industry, creating the corporate venture funds or the corporate vehicles that allow for that innovation to flow, whether internally in those companies or externally, leveraging the umbrella of that company as the enabler of that ecosystem. And finally, we still need to keep the large programs as sources of leap innovation, because that is where it is happening, but incorporating in a fast-paced and adaptive process the lessons from the front line. Third solution, we need to deregulate, deregulate, deregulate. It doesn't make sense. There are countries where anything above 10 million needs to go to approval by the cabinet. Or even 25 million here in Germany needs to go to the parliament. That's not agile. And in today's world, any executive in a mid-sized company probably has a decision authority that is above those levels.
All right, gentlemen, unfortunately, I'm going to have to stop you here.
Okay.
We are done with the time. Thank you so much. Huge round of applause for them, please. It was a fascinating look into all the conversations that you had throughout the 2 days. Thank you so much for presenting all of that to us.